Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the wonderful Louisa Adams, the wife of the sixth President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. And we have a lot to say about Louisa today, and we're going to have quite a bit to say about her successor, even though that's probably not the right title, Rachel Jackson. We'll talk about her next time, and that'll be quite a lengthy discussion. But I'm excited to talk to you about Louisa today and about what I think was probably a difficult marriage, but through her personal faith and her devotion to her family, Louisa hung in there. And there's so much to say about her. She is a first lady that has not enjoyed, I think, a lot of attention the way Abigail Adams has, and some of the others from the more modern era, or someone like Mary Lincoln. But her life was dramatic, to say the least. John Quincy had an extraordinary political career long before he was President of the United States. He worked with his father on diplomatic missions. He was a diplomat everywhere you can imagine. He will be Secretary of State. He'll be a senator from Massachusetts. After his presidency, he'll be a member of Congress from Massachusetts. So he's someone who was everywhere and went everywhere. And he took her along with him as much as he could. And I'm not quite sure that was the life that she had envisioned with him. But let's talk just a little bit about their courtship and about their marriage and their children and some of the things that they experienced. Louisa was born to an American father and an English mother. Her father was a Maryland-based businessman living in England, and her mother was um, someone who Abigail was just appalled that her mother was English born, and that well, that doesn't seem right. I think it's fair to say that Abigail would have liked no one that John Quincy was interested in, and she had proved that previously by standing in the path of another relationship. But it did seem a little problematic that, here was someone who was going to marry actually in 1797, with the revolution still fresh on everyone's mind. But I think, as I mentioned to you all before, that John Adams himself believed that our first best friendship would eventually be with England, and that these ills would be forgotten. But I don't think Abigail quite saw it that way. When John Quincy began expressing his interest in Louisa, they weren't quite he was she wasn't quite sure what to make of him. They did not share the bookishness that John Quincy's parents did. And that was always sort of a rift is too strong, but always sort of a difference between the two of them that made communication maybe a little more difficult. At difficult times in their lives, when she had something that was troubling her or they had a crisis, he would throw a book at her, not literally, but he would give her a book and say, see if this will help. Because that was his love language, and that was how, he had seen his parents communicate and express their affection for one another. We talked about that a little bit when we looked at John and Abigail. They had difficulties in their early courtship, not only because of some key differences in their personalities, but I believe that Louisa's father had some shaky financial footing. There was a question about her dowry, which is something we can't even relate to today. And at one point, I think she was sure that the marriage would never take place. And as a matter of fact, when he left her to go on one of his diplomatic assignments, he left her a list of books to read in his absence to help improve her mind. Now, you and I and Louisa would probably take exception to that. What's wrong with the mind I have? But you have to remember, John Quincy grew up with parents, again, who spoke a common language and their literary interests, and he just assumed that was going to be a way to share his affections with Louisa. Well, despite these difficulties early on, they will manage to marry and they will have extraordinary adventures with one another. They will have, I have the list of the children here. Um, they will have a son named George Washington Adams, born in 1801, John Adams II, 1803 to 1834, Charles Francis, 1807 to 1886, and then baby Louisa Catherine, 1811 to 1812. And sadly, Louisa suffered a number of miscarriages as well, and each of these were very heartbreaking to her. I want to talk a little bit about their children, and then we'll see what we can go on to today. Within the Adams family, and it may have come down from Abigail's family, the Smiths, there was a strain of alcoholism, and it will destroy uh, John Quincy's brothers, and then here two of his sons, George Washington and John. Both of them suffered from what's called morbid alcoholism, alcoholism that will eventually take your life. And it's even suggested that George Washington Adams, the oldest of the boys, may have committed suicide. So there's a lot of drama. There's quarreling over all three boys were interested in the same woman, and she will go with John Adams II, who nevertheless himself dies of alcoholism. He's called out as a coward by Andrew Jackson in his adult life, and Louisa will always blame Jackson for the premature death of her son and his morose alcoholism. So there's a lot of sadness and heartache on one of Louisa's trips with her husband. She will go to Russia, of all places, with him. He is a diplomat to Russia. And in that time, she has a baby girl, Louisa Catherine. And Louisa is actually is the Tsar of Russia at the time actually offers to be the godfather to Louisa, and John Quincy says no, thank you so much, and but no, thank you. But everyone's ecstatic because of the birth of this baby girl, and John Quincy, perhaps most of all. But somewhere about 11 months or so, the baby ceases to thrive. There's some thought, I took a lot of this from a lovely book called Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams by Louisa Thomas. I had always known about this daughter, but she gives a little more detail here. When Louisa began to wean her daughter, then the health problems began. It could have been because of a contaminated water source and a baby not having uh, the immunity built up to fight that. It could have been all kinds. It could have been the medical treatments that were applied. You know that this was a time when medical treatment and was almost as bad as the illness itself. But at about 13 months, the baby will die, and it just about destroyed Louisa. I don't think she ever recovered. And John Quincy will have to leave. Let me explain to you what's going on at this time. The Adams are there in Russia at the time Napoleon and his troops are coming in, and it's a nightmare. And she will have to take her son Charles and leave by herself because her husband has left um, before on another diplomatic mission. But when Louisa, our beloved Louisa, leaves, she writes in her journey. She's leaving in November, so imagine going through Russia in November, escaping, and hoping to get out before the French find you. She writes, My heart is buried in Louisa's grave, and my greatest longing is to be laid beside her. And I believe that she took that grief with her to her grave. She never got over that and never stopped blaming herself for it. Her past sins, which I can't imagine what they were, her past sins, her attempt to treat the baby, perhaps weaning the baby too early, all of these things plagued her, as did the death of her sons years later from their alcohol problems. So her life as the wife of a diplomat, the wife of a senator, the wife of a president in very tumultuous political times, it was not easy. As First Lady, she was magnificent, and I believe that she was a blessing to Elizabeth Monroe, helping out with some of the social duties during Miss Monroe's tenure. But Louisa would, her gift was music, and she played, among other things, the harp. And she would have drawing rooms. Well, that's what they were called, these little social things. They were drawing rooms where she would play herself or have other musicians for her guests. And so her entertaining centered around music. Now, her husband, John Quincy, as president, was probably the most unhappy president ever in the history of the office. He really did not want to be president. He was happier behind the scenes with diplomacy, with carving out treaties, and those were his gifts. He was fabulous at that. Very reasonable, very, I think, a little calmer head in some ways than maybe his father, but he was a great architect of negotiations. He was someone who could put it together and who could represent the United States. I think we mentioned before, he's really the architect of a number of treaties of America, with not the least of which, of course, was the Monroe Doctrine. More of a Monroe Doctrine, I guess we would call less a treaty and more of a, a statement of American resolve. So those were his gifts, and he was not comfortable in the office. The election of 1824 pitted him against Andrew Jackson. And you and I can talk all day about American politics today being so vicious and so unkind. Well, they were just that way in 1824. And I want you to know, I don't want to say anything about President Trump. Um, he stood for so many things that I champion too, but sometimes he could be a little, I guess, that's an understatement. He could be over the top in the way he talked to and about other people. And I see that same personality type in Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson spared no one that he felt, in terms of men, that he felt were in his political sights, his crosshairs. He took everything personal, everything became a personal issue. We'll talk more about that. But the election of 1824 was awful. And they raked everyone through the mud. And Jackson's own dear wife, Rachel, was drugged through the mud time and time again and made fun of. And John Quincy was made fun of. I don't know if anything was said about Louisa. That is something I should look into. That if they drug her in through it, I'm sure they did in terms of her Englishness, but I don't know if they did to her what they did to Rachel. But it was a terrible election, and we see the end of the era of good feelings in a big way. And we also see the end of the one party era. Now, I know you're saying, Miss Justice, I would rather talk about what Louisa wore and how she acted. I understand that. But I think it's important to say here, the old Federalist Party of Washington and John Adams is dead. The Democratic Republican Party that came out of the Jeffersonian era, there's where John Quincy is. And out of that party came Jackson's version of the Democratic Party. And I really see Andrew Jackson as the father of the modern Democratic Party. Others would say, no, it's FDR, no, it's Lyndon Johnson. But I think really its genesis begins here as a populist party, a people's party. It begins with Andrew Jackson. And my goodness, the things that were said and done during this election were terrible. And Jackson loses, owing largely to some contested, um, well, that's another lecture. He blamed other men, including Henry Clay and John, and well, we won't go there, but Henry Clay, he blamed him for his loss to John Quincy. And Jackson began campaigning immediately. So the whole 4 years that John Quincy is president, he's really having to defend his presidency and really having to deal with this man out here who's constantly trashing him. And I feel in a way like President Trump went through that side of it too, that he was constantly having to defend himself against his political enemies. He never had a chance to really be president without being on the defensive, being censured, being, criticized, anybody but Trump. So John Quincy experienced that, but I also see a parallel between President Trump and Jackson. So John Quincy was miserable. He was miserable as president, and I don't think he was a bad president. I don't think he had a chance to do things that he wanted to do. John Quincy has in his heart a deep animosity, as did his father, towards slavery. And I believe that he would love to have worked harder on eliminating that. And Jackson, as you know, is not going to mess with that. He's not going to mess with that. He's not going to. He is all about the states doing what they want to, as long as they don't interfere with the sanctity of the Union, as John C. Calhoun will find out. Having said all of that, her 4 years in the White House for Louisa were not easy years. They were not easy years. And I am sure she was relieved when in the terrible follow-up election of 1828, where she sees her husband defeated by Andrew Jackson this time. I'm sure she's relieved to be able to go home to Massachusetts. As First Lady, I see her as quite successful in that she held everything together for her family, for her husband during this period. She was considered a fine entertainer. She had some health difficulties that kind of kept her maybe not as active as she would have liked to have been. She had a terrible sweet tooth, and that caused her a lot of dental trouble and terrible pain with that. It really couldn't be dealt with effectively the way it is today. So I think with all of those issues, with the issues of her sons, one will die in 1829, I'm looking at these dates, another in 1834. Their decline had started before. I think she will see, this will take the toll on her, and she'll be glad to get out from under the pressure of being in this role. After they return home to Massachusetts, time passes, he begins his career in Congress. And the death of their boys, I believe they settle into a new relationship. They settle into one where they're not on the go, as we say, they're not on the go constantly going from one place to the other. All he has to do is to secure re-election in his House of Representatives position. But they can really get to know each other, and they really, I believe, come to terms with some of the things that have separated them over the years. Their personalities do not seem to be ones that easily mesh. I don't know if anybody could get along really well with John Quincy. John Quincy had loved another woman, much more earlier on, and his mother had stopped that relationship from going forward. So the Adams family, John Quincy, they had very difficult times, but they stayed together as a family and they held together and stood by one another. And I believe that Louisa and John Quincy did as well. Louisa's faith, the older she grew, the more it bubbled up to the surface, the more she became dependent on that just to get through all these difficult times. And I believe that the two of them grew closer together, and I believe their faith grew together. It's hard to find books that deal with this in a way that you and I, as born again Christians, can really understand. It spoke about sort of in there's a big section in this book about Louisa and her faith, but it is not in terms that we really understand. Uh, but I believe that it bound them together. John Quincy had been labeled a Unitarian like his father, and we talked about that a little bit, but I believe that he moved towards a more traditional, evangelical, if you will, faith and understanding of the nature of the Trinity. And there's a lot more biographies out there of John Quincy than there are of Louisa, but I think her understanding of the nature of Christ was like our understanding. And she unfortunately will have to watch her husband endure a stroke. It takes a lot out of his physical strength. He will be able to resume his career in the house before he finally has a final stroke that will end his life. And she herself will die shortly thereafter. She dies in 1852 and he dies in 1848. When Louisa died, and I thought this was very interesting, when Louisa died, on the day of her funeral, Congress suspended all business, and this was unprecedented. It had not been done before, at least for a First Lady. So this is a great show of respect, not only for the wife of a former president, but also for Louisa herself. I encourage you to look, if you're still looking for someone about whom to write, that you to look, and I'm going to say this probably about all of them, but I encourage you to look more into the life of Louisa. She had adventures that you and I can only imagine in the places that she went with him. Like Abigail, she was responsible on many occasions for looking to her family's needs with her husband far away. And and John Quincy, again, was no picnic. I think, maybe he may not have had an explosive temper like his father, but he could be cold and silent and withdraw completely into himself, and she wouldn't know quite how to reach him. Dolly was able to pull James Madison out of his quietness and remoteness, and Abigail, I think, could handle John without, I don't know if she threw a stick at him, but she was able to handle him when he would retreat. And I'm not sure that Louisa could, but she stood by him. And so there's something to be said for being a helpmeet when things are difficult and when you don't have a natural bond the way perhaps other couples might. I think the Madisons did and her in-laws did. But she is a fascinating character, a lovely and beautiful person, respected and talented in and of herself, and nothing was ever easy for her. Nothing was ever easy. Not money, not family, not responsibilities. So I think, in a way, her gift of loyalty and love to her husband was even more valuable. I hope that makes sense. I love talking about Louisa, and I wish I had more to say to you today. I was just going to talk about 15 minutes, and here I am at 25. But we're going to come back and talk about Rachel Jackson. I'm going to try to send you some information to give you some background on Rachel because her story is just about as dramatic, if not more so, than that of Louisa's. But I hope you're enjoying this, and I hope that you're seeing these women as women of emotions and heartbreak and joy, just like the rest of us, and yet they have this unprecedented role that they had to fulfill in the midst of all of these things. Hope some of this makes sense, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I would love for us to talk on FaceTime or Zoom, however you would like to do it. FaceTime might be easier if it's just the two of us, but let me know what you want to do, and I want us to get together and talk about Rachel soon because there's a lot to be said about her experiences. All right, well, thank you, and I hope that you are doing well.